In this episode of Right Pack Radio, we are going to talk about risk-taking and pushing the envelope. Writers, agents, and publishers, for the first time since the Gutenberg Press, find themselves lost in a maze of mystery as technology alters the shape of the publishing industry. Searching for Answers is a group of writers throwing pop culture, writing, and publishing into a crucible of clarity, passion, and humor. This group is the Right Pack. Welcome back to Right Pack Radio. This is your host and producer, David Allen Lucas, author of Crazy Things. Hopefully we'll have something soon and out in the stores, or at least on Amazon. That would probably be 2018. I am president of St. Louis Writers Guild, president of Winding Trails Media, and I am also a voice actor. I have my commercial demo out right now. I am currently working on my narration and animation voice demos, and I have recently found that my voices for animation is my true playground. When I get compliments from the sound engineer going, "I want my mommy," when I do very creepy voices, I consider that a good go. So, a lot of that, visit www.davidallenlucas.com for more information. And with me today is my lovely co-host.
Hello, I'm Kathleen Kayembe. I write speculative fiction under my own name. I have an essay in an anthology called Luminescent Threads, Connections to Octavia Butler, that is available for purchase now. It is wonderful. Y'all should check it out. I also write romance under my pen name, Kaseka and Vita, and I do freelance editing, and I'm starting up an Amherst Writers and Artists writing group in St. Louis.
And with us today is also somebody who has, and we'll explain in a minute, doing research and pushing the envelope and risk-taking to a new level.
Oh, geez. Hi, my name is Chanel A. Chan. I am currently an invalid. I write science fiction and fantasy. And that's about it when I'm not cracking my skull open.
Yeah, we'll explain this in a minute. Also with us is
Brad R. Cook, author of The Iron Chronicles, which is The Iron Horseman, Iron Zulu, and Iron Lotus. You can find out all about that at bradrarcook.com, along with all of my short stories. Check out Doom Flight of the Majestic, which just dropped a few weeks ago.
And you have a book coming out in November, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do any ideas on that?
We'll push it later.
Gotcha. Pushing it later. Moving right along.
Buy my short stories now. We'll push the books in a minute.
Also,
I'm Melanie Lucas, working very slowly on my fantasy novel.
And I'm George Soroy. I'm the president of the Missouri Writers Guild. I'm also an author of science fiction for the young adult reader, including my novel Excelsior, its upcoming sequel Ever Upward, Part 2 in the Excelsior Journey, and the 5-part serial From Parts Unknown. I am also an audiobook narrator with credits including the children's book Rumpelpimple by Suzanne DeWitt Hall, Argentum, Pause Volume 2 by Debbie Mamber-Kupfer, and the new Apple Book Award-winning book, The Golden Rule, by Jessica Marie Baumgartner. And for more information, just go to my website, he'sgotit.com.
all right. Excellent. And today we're going to, before we go into, let's talk about what today's topic is. And then I'll explain the comment I made about poor Chanel over there. Today we're going to talk about risk-taking and pushing the envelope with our writing. Being a little more experimental, and we'll have some terms here in a minute we're going to define. But, I always say to do your research really well when you write your book. So that way you know what you're writing. Well, Chanel accidentally decided to take that to the next level. Not only did she do her research, she became her own research.
Yeah.
Poor Chanel. She has a character who has a concussion, and right now Chanel has a concussion.
Yeah, it was I didn't do it on purpose, I promise. Yeah, it was an unfortunate incident between me and some IKEA furniture, and really, really shoddy timing on my part.
Yes.
Well, write what you know.
Yes.
The thunk that the sound that it made when it hit my skull. Yes, that was great.
So, Kathleen, you want to define terms before we get started, and let's go for it.
Yes, so I looked up the dictionary definition of risk, but I'm going to use the Wikipedia definition of risk because it follows more along the lines of what I think we'll be discussing today. So Wikipedia defines risk as the potential of gaining or losing something of value. Values such as physical health, social status, emotional well-being, or financial wealth can be gained or lost when taking risks resulting from a given action or inaction, whether foreseen or unforeseen. Risk can also be defined as the intentional interaction with uncertainty. So, now that we have our terms,
What is some risk taking you can take with your writing, and how do you determine if it's worth it? Let's go with that. Go for it.
well, in the interest of defining terms again, are we talking emotional, relational, reputational risks? Are we talking character plots, that sort of risk? Are we talking financial risk? What sort of risks are we going to discuss?
Yes. D, E, F, G, wherever all of the above is going to fall into that.
In other words, there's a lot of risk.
There's a lot of risk.
I would recommend that risks to personal health be avoided at all costs.
Gee, I can't imagine why. So, if I wanted to explore writing a scene about doing a halo, which is a high altitude, low opening parachute jump, I might not want to do that physically. I might want to talk to people who have done that. Not that I haven't done that physically. But anyway.
Well, there are a number of risks one could potentially take depending on the type of research you need to do to write a character or to write a given plot. It's not a huge risk if I go to a gun range and learn to fire a gun there because it's all very controlled. It is a bigger risk if I do that sort of thing, if I learn to fire a gun in a situation that is far less controlled. For example, the zombie apocalypse, or because I found somebody's gun and decided to fire it in their backyard when there are neighbors all around, I'm risking going to jail.
Yeah, not to mention risking life.
So risk smart. Also, yeah, I could have, not understood how to use their gun and had it backfire in my face. Risking my face.
Don't risk the face.
What's some risk you can do with writing itself? Maybe stylistic changes, things that you've been told not to do, but yeah, will work out. Go ahead, Brad.
Well, I would just say that the biggest one is to say the risk is good. I mean, the whole point of writing and doing all of this, the entire endeavor of the craft we're pushing forward is to push your book as far as you can, to take the risk and, run with it, to try and go into the territory other people have not gone into, to touch onto the subjects other people have not touched onto, to show new light into areas that, into situations we already know, and by taking those risks, your work will stand out, it will be unique, and hopefully it'll be really good. And then there's the other kinds of risks that you were describing, like, am I going to put a lot of money behind this book?
Yeah.
Is anyone actually going to read this book once it comes out? There's a lot of risk that goes into all this kind of stuff. Not to mention, then there's the fun ones like, do I try this email service or this email service? Do I go on this social media or this one? All kinds of risk.
Along with that, then I'm going to go to you here next. Is you may have a stamp. I'm going to pick on Brad for a minute.
Uh-oh.
Love him to death, but he writes a lot of steampunk. He writes middle grade. That's your brand. So, if you wrote something that wasn't that, let's take this to extreme. Let's say he wrote an adult erotica.
Already done.
Okay.
But did you publish
I'm
it?
so
No,
pleased.
I have not published it.
Okay.
Why would
so-
you not tell me this sooner? I thought I was the only erotica writer on the panel right now.
Well,
You are, because yours published and is probably way good.
so Brad publishes. We'll say this is completely made up, but Brad publishes that. What type of risks does he take if it's published under Brad R. Cook, like the rest of his books?
That'd be a huge risk.
It would be a huge risk.
Yeah.
That's
Because you
kind
have a
of
bunch of little
delay.
kids reading stuff they should not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think coming into this conversation, we need to. I think what Brad said about risk taking being good is true. It is good to take a certain amount of risk with your writing. And I think it is also good to acknowledge that by virtue of trying to get published, there is a lot of risk taking involved,
Yeah.
both in the writing process, will what I write be marketable, to sending things to agents and choosing an agent instead of a different agent, or a publisher instead of a different publisher. And there are risks in the book that you created itself, with what kind of characters you did versus what kind of person you are versus what kind of research you did. So, I mean, there are a lot of different risks, and I think maybe we should narrow and then go cover them more systematically.
I agree.
Okay, so let me go with one risk you just mentioned. I'm going to jump to George after that, then I've got Chanel after that. And that is where to publish today. Do you go traditional publish, which right now you've got the big 5 houses, and you do have small presses which don't have as much money towards them? Do you go independent published? Now I'm talking about your first book. And if you go independent published, where do you want to go with that? Do you want to stay independent the rest of the time? Because that's a risk. Do you want to try for a hybrid? Again, risk. Right now hybrids is growing, but that can always change. It's a good question about risk.
My real story regarding risk, just kind of centers around my 5-part serial from Parts Unknown, because that in itself, from the conception, was a big risk, because I was trying out a storyline that was going to be looked at as having a very, very niche market, to the point of when I finished the novel, after writing so many drafts of a screenplay of it, I sent it over to an agent to take a look at it, and he advised that I self-publish it because it was too much of a niche market, too much of a risk for any agents to try to tackle. And so I continued along that path, and not only took that risk by working with iUniverse, by making a financial risk, by putting my own money into it. And then years later, when I realized that I didn't like the story anymore and needed to rewrite it, took another risk by creating the 5-part serial that it was. And now it's, so it's a constant, game of risk with this particular story, because it's not a universally appealing type of story, but I still believe that it is worth the risk just because I believe in this story.
Chanel, Brad, Tiffany.
Okay, I was just going to ask and or suggest that, so it seems like the discussion is going more in the way of risks in terms of publishing and decisions along that route versus risks in terms of the story itself.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
No,
Yes, the question.
yes, the question. The answer is no, both sides are wide open.
Okay. Well, then I guess we'll just address one now and then one later.
Right. Yeah.
So then I guess the question I would ask for those of you out here,
In the studio.
in the room, that I already asked this question. How do you ascertain those risks? How do you judge that one against the other?
I'll jump on that because that falls into what I was going to talk about with to answer Dave's question too. There is a wonderful. I'll start off with this. There's a wonderful. It's like a flow chart or a graphic. I know Jane Friedman had it on her blog. That's the last place I remember seeing it, so you can probably scroll back and find it. It's somebody put this together. I'd tweet it out if I knew the name. But anyway, point being is it lists the 6 roads of publishing that are on there, and they're all color-coded. It's like a single color-coded bar, and what each one kind of provides. That's probably the best place to start. What I was going to say to Dave's question, though, and this is the answer, and I think this is important to say, is there is no right answer to publish on how to publish. There are so many options from do you do it all yourself? Do you get somebody to help you do it? Do you get a small publishing house to do it? Do you get a medium publishing house? Do you get a large publishing house? The only thing that I would ever caution anybody about when trying to find a publisher is never to just blanketly hand over a check and get a book back unless that's something you know you want to do. Vanity presses can take a lot of, they can take advantage of you because you don't know anything as an author about the publishing industry, and that's okay, but there's a lot you can learn. However, in this day and age, I used to always say, and this is still my number one thing, is I always suggest starting with an agent. Try and go the agent route. Query an agent, submit it, because if you've written the next Harry Potter, you want that to go to an agent who's going to take it and turn it into a giant book series, a giant movie series, go all around the world with it, put it in large print, put it in audiobooks, all that kind of stuff. And that's awesome. So start there. And if you don't get that, then all roads are open. There are still massive amounts of agents left that you can go to, some of whom, run the scale of how they do it. And I mean that in the sense some will help you self-publish it instead of, trying to help you find a publisher or anything like that. We have new breeds of agents now.
Yeah, I was gonna say a few years ago that didn't exist.
No, that's a whole new part of the industry now. But the point is, there are so many roads now. I'd say pick the one that's best for you, but it's really the one that best suits the project. Because you might use a self-publishing for this project, but you might use a small press for another project. You might submit your Harry Potter to Scholastic and turn it into awesomeness. It's about the project and where you're going to publish it. And that's why it becomes important then for authors, once they reach past the writing stage, to kind of learn a little bit about your options. And Google's your best friend. But there is a great chart out there that Jane Friedman had on her blog not too long ago. I'd recommend it there. You might be able to find it under publishing paths or something like that, I think was the article. I might try and look it up here in a bit. And we've got time. If I can find it, I'll let you guys know. But that would be my biggest advice to anyone looking for publishers. There's a lot of risk out there, financial risk to your name. No one ever thinks about what happens if your first book tanks. That could kill the rest of your career. It doesn't have to, though. A lot of people write a first book that doesn't do well and then go on to write, Game of Thrones. So.
Yeah, not to mention too, any books tanking in your career can cause a huge hiccup to that career.
Yeah, that's it. The Key Book Publishing Paths, 2017. Jane Friedman published it 3 months ago. But that's the name of the article. The Key Book Publishing Paths.
Okay, since we are recording in the past for the future, 3 months ago was when? Was it published?
July, June-ish.
June.
May, June-ish.
So June 2017 for our listeners. Jane Friedman.
The Book Publishing Paths.
The Book Publishing Paths.
2017.
I was going to bring up something that's kind of in between the risks that you take with the content of your project versus the publishing of your project. And that was memoir. If you are writing a memoir, or you are writing something where someone in your life is potentially recognizable in one of the characters in your project, the decision to then publish that book and put it out into the world can bring up a host of legal risks and potential reputational risks, because these are people that are part of your life, and if they're still alive or their families are still alive, can protest very vociferously and detrimentally to your life.
Yeah. Libel laws.
Nothing like having a Thanksgiving dinner right after you saw each other in court. Along with that too, depending on what you want to write your memoir about, and depending on what you've done in your life, you may need to get special permissions to have your memoir published. Go ahead.
I was just going to throw out there, or something that reads like a memoir but isn't, because people will see themselves in whatever you publish and assume that that is your opinion or view or whatever. Like, for example, I published a story about a girl who was like ambiguous in some sort of ways, and then and had a certain characteristic, and someone else completely randomly that also shared this characteristic was like, "You wrote this story about me," and I'm like, "No, I didn't," but I'm glad you can find that relatable. I don't know. It's I feel like that's something that's also fairly risky when it was writing in general. Is if there are characters, there will always be someone that sees you in a work that you were not including yourself in.
Something that writers can do to mitigate that particular risk is if you are using characters that are inspired by people from your life, changing enough significant details about those people, or mix and matching enough about these people that no one person can be seen as a one-to-one ratio between the person who's a character and the person in your life.
Mixing and matching can be a great way of avoiding creating a true representation of somebody.
Yeah, but that being said, there are plenty of stories of authors who made some logical choices to do with character and situation, and found out later that those were things that had happened in real life. Like, I think it's Isabel Allende who has a story about a priest who hears a confession and realizes murder is going to happen, or a murder has taken place. And the priest does something about it. And Isabel Allende had done this book inspired from life, but not in any way as nonfiction. And she was approached later by the priest that she had made up, who had actually heard the confession that she had also made up in the story. And he was like, "How did you know?" And he was in fear for his life. So as a writer, sometimes things are going to happen because you're going to make logical choices based on character, setting, plot. And people are going to see themselves in those choices, whether or not they're there, in fact, as Chanel was saying. So, I mean, that's not really something you can help once it's out of your hands and in the public. People are going to read what they want to into it, not their intent is not as important.
Right.
So true. So real quick, this is not legal advice, so do check with legal before you do anything.
Do you want my little disclaimer for you?
No, there's no need. I was trying to do the quick version. But anyway, so yes, if you're going to write about people you know, you are already on a slippery slope. Because those people can come back at you if you have said something really negative about them. However, as Kathleen said, changing details, you can avoid libel laws. You have to change enough, though, so that a reasonable person cannot make the distinction that this is that person, because that's what they're going to ask a jury. It is up to the person to prove that the author, and this is where I'm throwing out the legal thing, because I'm pretty certain this is right, but I'm not exactly 100%. That it is up to the person to prove that they are the ones covered in the book. It is not up to the author to prove he did not write about the person. Now, having said all of that, there's a myriad of things you can do to change details and do things like that. But I highly recommend inserting your ex-husbands into books and killing them off, or, getting your enemies back and, eviscerating them in fiction, so to speak. But to connect with that, I have run into this not necessarily from other people finding themselves in my characters, but people accusing me of writing my books like that my books are me. And that, either I have inserted tons of relationships of my own into them, or they are somehow my id come to life, which I find kind of amusing. Now, I will admit, some of the family drama in Iron Horseman is there not because of the family drama in my life, but because I was writing about the family drama that was there. But people are always like, "Oh, you wrote this, thing with, a character and his dad because you don't have the best relationship with your dad." It's like, no, that was not it, even on a subconscious level. And then the other one that I love is I wrote a whole story And it's about a writer. I'll throw that out there. But the writer ends up like hooking up with a girl, and everyone's like, "Oh, you totally like this is your." And I'm like, "No, that writer is not me in any way, shape, or form, just because they're a writer." So I love that notion. It's something I had to learn the hard way because you just write things and you put them out in the world, and then people go, "Oh, you were thinking this when you wrote that." And it's like, no. Which is why I always love English teachers, because there's the whole notion that, it's blue, the curtains are blue to show the ocean and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, no. I just really wanted to make the curtains blue because
They were blue.
that was just, the color scheme I had going in the house at that moment. That's really how that all came about. But if you want to believe that there's some sadness and, verbose in those curtains, sure. But it's something I find hilarious, so. Risk
No.
taking.
Yeah,
And then, Kathleen?
I don't remember what time period. I haven't seen it recently because it was always kind of ridiculous. But like in a certain time period, there were all these books, and sometimes it was just flat out ridiculous where they were. But all characters. There was this disclaimer in books. All characters are. This is a work of fiction. All characters.
Oh,
Are,
like you would see on TV nowadays.
Yeah, and the issue is some of the books. There was one. Oh, what was the name of the book? I'm blanking. David Eddings' book. He's a fantasy writer, by the way. He was writing in the era of. I'm blanking on it, but the point is, unless he was worried about being compared to other fictional characters, his disclaimer said, this isn't about real life events. Yeah, the whole magic kind of gave it away there. Why?
To this day, check open your books that you have next to you. All of my books and all of the books that I've had published, and most of the books published today, in the front matter, have a whole blurb about how the character is created in this, or the works are created by the author. These are not intended, these are works of fiction, not intended to be related. These are not related to anybody if they are. It's whole like legalese. Yeah, George is
Yeah,
always up right
George
there.
was just looking. George just got his proofs back
Yeah,
for two of
so
the stories. And it's
this
just like, I wanna
is
make
still
sure
a
that's in there.
thing in every fiction book that gets published, just to cover your butt.
It was funny. I was reading a book
Thank you, attorneys.
written by Elliot Roosevelt, and he wrote some fiction books about his parents, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, and his had the anti-disclaimer. The characters of this book, any resemblance is not a coincidence, admit to me.
Wow.
Because he was writing about his parents, and it was a fictional story about his mother being a sleuth and solving murders that occurred in the White House. But
That's
it
pretty
was
cool.
yeah.
Awesome.
That's a TV show we need. Eleanor Roosevelt running around solving crime.
Right.
Yeah, I'm down with that. She
Yeah.
can hook up with like Amelia Earhart and all her cool
Yes.
friends.
Oh my gosh.
'Cause Eleanor had, like, the
League of
coolest friends.
Extraordinary Gentlemen, but
Yeah.
U.S. soil.
Yeah, with like,
It's
It's like Young Indiana Jones meets Murder, She Wrote.
Yeah, there you go.
Awesome.
Yeah, okay, so no, I'm not going to write that story right now. Moving on.
Actually, Elliot Roosevelt already wrote it.
I know, I was joking. I
someone
was
needs to
playing.
take it and turn it into
I
a
was
movie.
joking. Go ahead.
So it sounds like we're beginning to kind of transition into risks that you take with the content of your work. So what are some of the risks that we've all taken with the content of our work, with our plot, characters, type of character? Chanel.
Do I have to raise my?
Let's see. One of the risks that it paid off, didn't pay off, the jury's still out. I anticipated, I gave my reader too much credit. Like, I gave them too much, I anticipated them putting things together much more quickly and thoroughly than they did. And I got some backlash for it. And I regret nothing. But there was a story, and I've told Kathleen about this a bajillion times before. I've probably mentioned it on here, whatever. That there was a character that was, I intentionally left the character's gender as something that I did not state. I did not state she, I did not state he. I didn't not make any blanket statements about the character's gender. I literally just wrote it first person. This is what they're thinking, this is what they're seeing, etc. And purposefully, it was intended for the audience to assume that this character was male. And then kind of in a very jarring for some people juxtaposition, I had the character immediately after this scene interacting with their boyfriend and in a very physical manner. So a lot of people were really upset. They're like, well, it's not clear in the beginning that it's a girl. I'm like, well, no shit, Sherlock. That's kind of the point. Like I was really kind of toying with gender expectations and how they were formulating this character in their minds and how they had to second guess that based on the information they were given, and it was on purpose. But a lot of there were some people that were very offended, but then they felt like I had tricked them on purpose. I would never, ever do that. I promise.
Kathleen, you got the dovetail.
So I'm reading a book called Writing the Other by Nisi Shaw and Cynthia Ward, and what they call that is the unmarked state, a person's preconceived default narrator character, their idea of the default narrator in a story when nothing is specified otherwise. So for you, in this case, your readers were defaulting to male, and you left the narrator in that unmarked state until you gave enough detail to let the reader know, oh, that was wrong.
It gave me such joy.
George?
To answer your question about, what kinds of risks and everything we took with our storytelling, one thing that I did not mention when I was, talking about my stories before, is that I basically went under the assumption that people would remember that there was more science fiction in the 1970s other than just Star Wars. There were, yeah.
I'm joking with that statement.
I know it.
Best sci-fi art, man. Come on.
Yeah, and I wanted to create something that was a shout out to that era, specifically one of my personal favorites from the 1970s, Rollerball. And so there are elements of Rollerball along with elements of one of my all-time favorite films, Network, that's in this, and then I threw in elements of The Manchurian Candidate and No Holds Barred on top of that. And so that was my own little risk, was having fun with this long forgotten part of the science fiction genre. The funny thing is that when the 2002 version of From Parts Unknown came out, it was around the same time that they decided to do a remake of Rollerball. And I was so excited because I was thinking okay, great, this can kind of tie into that and everything. And then I saw the movie and it was such a piece of garbage that I was just like, I had nothing to do with that one. So,
Tell us how you really feel.
right.
Brad, then Kathleen, then me.
Come on, half the movie is about face tattoos.
Right.
Okay, so, I don't like talking about my risk. My biggest risk as an author is probably one of the touchiest subjects in entertainment today. And it's something I have to really be reticent of and careful of, and that's that I really, I don't just like writing white people.
Yeah.
But as, a white guy, and I am a very fervent belief in the own movement, the own voice movement. I don't think it should just be white guys writing about other races and genders and all of this kind of stuff. But very specifically, when I was writing the Iron Chronicles, I very much knew what I was doing from the start. That yes, I have a central white character because that was where I was going with it. And to be honest, I was writing in a Victorian universe, so it kind of had to be. Beyond that, though, the risks became making the female character the strong one, more the alpha character between them, and then taking Indahar Singh, who is a Sikh, and turning him into one of the main characters, and not letting that go, no matter what my publisher or anyone else said, and knowing very much that I wanted to write, that I very much wanted a Sikh on this journey. And I very much wanted to portray the Sikh as they are. They get a lot of misrepresentation in today's culture, So I wanted to give them a very positive light there. For Iron Zulu, it was set in Africa. I very much wanted to play with an African characters, but I didn't want to make them any of the standard Victorian literature crap that you've ever seen about standard African characters that they would bring up. So I very much base them in reality. They're both Owethu and his father are based off of actual Zulu, a Zulu king and his son. And that was a way of ensuring those remained authentic as possible, and ensured that I fought to keep them as authentic as possible. And then for Iron Lotus, I knew very much that I wanted to spend time in Asia and exist in that kind of Nepalese area. But I very much wanted a Chinese character. I wanted to play with the Chinese character. There were things I wanted to bring up and highlight about it. But I don't want to seem exploitive about this, which is something for me was a big risk, because I was afraid everyone was going to be like, oh, you're just writing about all of these, you're taking these like stereotypical tropes from other cultures and just slapping them onto your characters and calling it a book or whatever. It was a big struggle for me to ensure that all of those voices very much remained true to themselves and yet not the stereotypical tropes or anything that you would normally see, to break some of that, but also then because I don't just want to write about myself as a white male character. So that's some of my biggest risks. It's something that I work hard to try and create authentic voices that aren't necessarily mine. It's something I think writers have the ability to do, but I also think it's a dangerous slope to just say, oh, I can write anything. No, you can't, but with enough research, you can probably write something pretty close.
Chanel?
So I have kind of the opposite issue. Well, not the opposite issue, but it's coming from a different angle. When I was young, like really, really young, and started writing, like in my early teens, I was convinced that I was not able to write a character that looked like me and have anyone be interested in it. I was very convinced that my characters could not be a black female. I was very convinced that no one would want to read it, and that no one would want to read anything having to do with someone like me. So as I've grown as a writer, one of the risks that I had to start to make myself do, I couldn't in good consciousness, exclude myself from my own work. So one of the risks that I had to do, as a personal duty to myself, I had to take this risk, was to learn to write myself into my books. I had to learn and to become comfortable with writing characters that looked like me, the characters that I grew up with, the characters that used to live down the street from me. That was a risk and I would be lying if I said that it's not something that I struggle with, because I'm like, well, if I say that way, I know that's how it would be said, but it'll come off sounding very X, or it'll be portrayed as very Y, and I don't want that. So it's kind of a fine line that I'm having to walk there, and it's a risk that I'm willing to take, but it's hard.
I can definitely identify with that. That's why I love Octavia Butler so much, because before I started reading her, I thought people who looked like me there was no place for them in fiction, except in roles that were not necessarily accurate,
Mm-hmm.
but they were what people would believe, because those are the roles that were accepted. So yeah, writing people who are other to who you are is a big risk that writers are becoming more able to take responsibility these days, which I think is wonderful. When I started my novel Jinx, it was about 10 years ago, and I knew there was no way a big publisher would ever publish it, because the main characters are two female people of color, and they're in a lesbian relationship. So I knew if I ever approached a publisher about it, they would probably be like, make one of these male, and do they both have to be not white? So it's been in the past 10 years since I started writing it that I've been like, oh my gosh, I could actually go to a big publisher with this if I wanted to when it's done. And I could not have done that 10 years ago. So depending on when you're writing a thing, the risks will be higher or lower. And I think one of the great things about the the push for own voices and the push for we need diverse books is that people are recognizing that there are many stories that you can tell, and that means everybody can tell their own story now, or at least more than they could have.
No, it's very true. In fact, I love that because I got to read parts of Jinx years ago, and at the time, it was a radical book. I mean, it was so far afield from like what you would normally see. And it was really cool. I mean, I loved reading. It was like, really great. And I love that now it's practically mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Kathleen's not kidding. She could really take this book that 10 years ago no one would have touched, and nowadays it could be made into a movie with ease. And I love that. And it really does show kind of how the world has slid and moved and progressed. But it's amazing. So there is that notion of that risk has an element of time to it.
Mm-hmm.
A risk is, tied to a certain element of time. And you can wait, and maybe that risk will lessen. But yeah, I love that about that story too. It's a very interesting thing.
There is another story that I don't think there will ever be a time for that I've written. There are some stories you write because they come to you and you agree, I'm going to write this thing. And you also recognize as you're writing it that it can never go out. It will always be under the bed or in your trunk or whatever your metaphor for shelving a book is. And this story, and I think many stories along this vein, are stories about taboo relationships or behaviors. This story in particular was told from the point of view of a minor, and this minor was the victim of sexual abuse. But because of the mindset that goes on at a certain age, when you're in those situations, the idea of consenting is different for the minor than it would be for anyone looking outside this relationship. And the reason I will never submit it anywhere is because there are some ideas that need to not be spread. There are some people who could misread the situation that I have put down and interpret that as permission to do something that I personally find reprehensible and that is legally wrong and morally wrong according to the laws of our entire culture, to say nothing of certain religions within that culture. So for me, the risk was in writing a relationship like that. It was an emotional risk, but that is as far as the risk is going for me, because the risk as far as publishing that sort of story is wider spread than anything that is just mine.
Brad?
No, Chanel's got
Oh, sorry, didn't see.
I have a story that I'm actually still currently working on, and it is, it's described an incestuous, I don't want to say incestuous relationship, incestuous incident, I don't know. And honestly, the knowing the risk that I was taking with it really informed the way that I told the story, because there are so many ways, like left, right, and center of that I could have told the story that could have made it so much more Squick Factor-esque. But the only way that I could tell it in good faith was to take that risk and almost minimize it or downplay it as much as I possibly could and still get the story itself out.
Kathleen?
I have a dovetail to myself, which is so self-centered, literally. So one of the things Stephen King, I believe, talks about in On Writing is a story that he wrote when he was beginning his publishing career about a school shooting. And it was pre-school shooting era America. And his publisher, I believe, didn't want to publish it, but he was determined to get it out there, so he got it published. And when school shootings began, ever since, he has been unable to stop questioning whether his book played a part in that idea being spread and normalized in our society. So he has a book of short stories, I think it's Nightmares and Dreamscapes, where he has a man who plans and commits a murder with road construction equipment by burying someone alive in their car. And what he said in the intro to that story, to tell you kind of a little bit about the process behind it, is that that story, if you tried what happens in that story, you could not replicate what was done. He knows how to do it, but he purposely changed details so that if anyone tried to commit a crime like that, they would be unable to do it, because he does not want to be responsible for that sort of thing.
Yeah, real quick, just gonna say along with it, when Stephen King published that, there were school shootings happening, just wasn't on the news at the level it was happening, and wasn't at the level that the first big one, Columbine, was. Secondly, you'll see in film, and especially in film, books and so forth, where martial artists are writing or are acting, and I'm going to say, I think Steven Seagal's acting is way overdone, but his martial arts movies do have correct moves, but he leaves out certain shots, so you can't actually do the kill moves that he actually is doing in those movies.
That's so responsible.
To add on to what Kathleen was just talking about, that was when Stephen King created the pseudonym for himself, Richard Bachman.
Correct.
Yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, Stephen King fans, please correct me, but I think the book that she's talking about is Rage.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's the
right.
one. So just to add a little, cherry on top of that. So.
And knocking the ping pong ball back at Brad.
Yes. So we've, talked about risk and all that kind of stuff, and you're right that when you write these kind of risks, you're taking probably the biggest risk as a writer. Because not only are you touching onto a subject that is taboo or something, people don't talk about, but to be honest, I would almost say that's where we as writers are supposed to go, or, we open the doors that other people don't. And part of the reason we do that is to explore and to see what's out there and to push and to drive back the darkness and push forward the light. But I would say one of the reasons I started this off with the fact that risk is good is because a lot of risk generally will pay off in huge reward. If you think about some of the topics we've just touched on, there are novels that touch on all of them. Lolita, if you're looking for, something, on the incestuous, not incest.
The adult versus
adult kid,
child.
Yeah. And if you want incest,
Pedophilia,
Game of Thrones.
Or Flowers in the Attic.
Like there are, and my point to this isn't that risk is just good and you have to push. Mike is cautioned, and this is why I'm bringing it up. There is taking a risk to push forward on a subject, to open a door people don't see, to touch on a subject that people don't like talking about because we have to move forward the narrative. There is also taking a risk just for shock value. Game of Thrones, which I just brought up, is probably huge for this. 99% of the real edgy stuff that they smack you with is just for shock value. Yes, there's this great love affair between, the brother and the sister, Jaime and Cersei, and it's one of the great love affairs of the show. But it's probably in there to titilize and tantalize and, hit people up with that. Some of the crazy stuff that you'll see, is it really taking a risk and pushing forward into new territory, or are you just using it as gratuitous whatever, gratuitous violence, gratuitous sex, gratuitous, gore, and then, moving on without ever actually touching on it. At that point, I think you've done a disservice to your work. If you're just using it for the shock value, you're missing out on the chance of using it and pushing forward with it and doing something really amazing. I mean, the reason why Lolita is a book that still gets read even today is not because it's this book about an older guy and a young girl. It's because of the themes it touches on and what it talks about and how it portrays the relationship it's become this seminal novel that touches on a whole field of things, and it makes you think. Ergo, people still read it. You know, I haven't. I stayed away. Not my thing. I did see the movie, but you know, whatever. But it's just, you know, if that's, we all, you know, we make fun of a lot of literature and a lot of, you know, that kind of highbrow stuff, but a lot of literary novels are pushing into this territory. It's why they're character driven, not plot driven, you know, all that kind of stuff. So risk can be good, but risk for the sake of exploration, understanding, pushing forward into a territory that we're uncomfortable with, that's good. Just using it for shock value could be bad.
Chanel?
The other thing that I would have to say in terms of just using something for shock value is it's desensitizing,
Yeah.
and in that sense normalizing, which is why it's really, in my opinion, and really important to be very delicate when you're pushing the envelope with these things, because you are, even by you quote unquote doing it right,
Yeah.
you are still putting it out there, mainstreaming it, so that it becomes just another thing that people see. And by that, you are sort of diminishing the shock and the horror and the appropriate, quote unquote, emotional response to it. Which is why I have a whole thing with Game of Thrones, but that's something completely different.
Kathleen and then George, you close us out.
You would go?
Go for it.
I wanted to know about emotional risks that we have taken. I know as someone with a history of emotional issues every so often, depending on my brain chemistry, there are certain risks I can take in writing at certain points, but not at others. And I find that I can go farther into darker places with my writing when I am coming from an emotionally stable, kind of safe time and headspace. And if I go to those same places when I am not in a safe headspace, that can propel me into dark times.
Well, as we've seen, I'm go big or go home. So honestly, I find that my darkest, most compelling stuff comes when I'm coming from a darkest place. Is it the healthiest thing to do? Absolutely not. But it's the catharsis of it sort of fuels the writing for me. Is that an emotional risk? Absolutely. Is that something that any mental health professional would advise? Probably not. But it is what it is.
Well, there are some kinds of writing that will help just to express them. Like, what was it? I think Neil Gaiman or Stephen King said that like horror writers are some of the most cheerful, down-to-earth people, and comedians seem quite bitter by comparison and unhappy. And that comes, I think, with exercising all of your demons versus how, like on the page, versus living them in your life and seeing them everywhere and having to learn to laugh at them when nothing is really funny. So, I do think that when you're writing in a dark time about dark themes, you can get really good writing out of it. I just would advise people to try and be safe about things.
Yeah, the downward spiral is a real thing,
Like-
and it's really rough to get out of.
If there's no you to do the writing, then no writing will be done. So make sure the you remains after the writing is done.
And I think we're on the cusp of seeing Hollywood even starting to take more risks, because they're starting to realize, and we're seeing more and more articles being posted throughout the internet, but we're seeing that box office tallies are way down than expected, because further down than expected, and it's because a lot of these franchises that they had been putting all of their heart and soul into are drying up. So we're basically like coming around a point where we were in the late 60s when Hollywood decided to take a risk and see what the younger upcoming filmmakers had to say, and all of a sudden we got Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde and the first real shots that that really wound up changing the industry. And it's funny to me that 40 years ago we saw a very big risk by a young filmmaker who decided to put out something that was completely unlike anything that was out there that wound up changing the industry, which was Star Wars.
Yep.
So like you want to talk about a risk, there is there in itself was a big risk. So I'm hoping that we'll see more risks in all shapes and sizes being given a big screen treatment, because I think they deserve it nowadays.
And on that note, let's go ahead and say that risk is what we do. Whether we want to admit to it or not, risk is being part of a writer, as it's been said a few times in here. Just knowing how to do it right and how to do it correctly. And on that note, tune in next week for yet another interesting topic in the writing industry. Thank you for listening. Have a great week writing. Bye-bye. The new theme songs for Right Pack Radio were written and performed by Meredith Tate. All copyrights remain with her.